We were at dinner last night, and I was saying to Bob, you know, you never could predict where life will take you, because our very first interactions, I was a junior faculty member starting out in a research project in this fairly sort of new, I wouldn't say untried area, but a new way of approaching the aspects of how do we target cognition and psychosis. And Bob was my program officer at the time, and he gave me just incredible support and wise advice and feedback about how to think about the next set of studies that just stuck with me during those formative years. And here we are, whatever it is, 15 years later, at least something like that. And here I am in Minnesota, and here Bob is in this role, both in a very key leadership role within the NIMH, but also this role on the international stage of transforming psychosis research. And we're meeting up here in Minneapolis today. Just, as I said, an incredible pleasure. I personally consider Bob a treasure in terms of my own development as a researcher and as a thinker about psychosis, but he really is in many ways a treasure to the field of mental health services research, and I'm about to tell you why. His current role at the NIMH is Director of the Division of Services and Intervention Research, tell you about some of the awards I mean, this could go on and on. I'm going to give you a few and then I'm going to tell you about why he's played such a key role in where the field is at. So, among his many awards, he's received the Special Presidential Commendation from the American Psychiatric Association. He's received the Department of Health and Human Services Hubert Humphrey Award for service to America. He's the National Institutes of Health Directors. He's received the National Institutes of Health Directors Award and the NIMH Supervisor of the Year Award. So beyond these many professional accomplishments, what Bob has done is something that one sees very, very rarely I think in medically oriented research in general, but certainly in the field of mental health research, which he himself has been a scientist. He has also been someone who has been a leader and an administrator within the National Institute of Mental Health, helping direct the trajectories of kind of research initiatives. He himself has played a key role directing very specific research initiatives that have really transformed how we think about early psychosis, both the prodromal or ultra-high-risk phases as well as the treatment phases after a first episode. But more than that, once the research that he has been played such a key role in making sure it happened and that it happened correctly, once the results of that research have come out, Bob has gone the next step, and this is what is really rare. He has thought, how do we take these results, how do we take these new understandings that we are developing about psychosis, early phases of psychotic illness, and how do we actually shift practice in the country? How do we partner with SAMHSA, with the community, with real practitioners in real-world settings so that they can start to develop an evidence-based approach to the treatment of these illnesses, but do it in a way which is actually feasible for them and practical for them and sustainable from a financial perspective. And it's that ability, and in fact it will be, I think, a main thrust of his talk today, that is so rare, right? Lots of good researchers, lots of good leadership at NIMH, but very, very few people who think then about how do we actually change what we do for patients. And on top of that, Bob is also just an incredible human being. He joined the National Guard, right? And you were in Afghanistan after 9/11, volunteered to do that, felt it was sort of an imperative in terms of serving his country. He, on an interpersonal note, is incredibly, both I've seen him with junior people as well as with senior people. He's positive, he's focused, he's forward-thinking. He blends that combination of good science, done right, proper designs, but also pragmatic. How would it translate? Where does it actually end up taking us? Again, this sort of unique constellation of kind of personal and intellectual characteristics. You're about to see that for yourself in this talk, so please join me in welcoming Dr. Heinssen.
Sophia, thank you very much for that warm welcome, and thank you for the invitation. After that build-up, I can tell you it only goes downhill from here. So, So it's a pleasure today to talk to you about a process of accelerating the translation of science into procedures that will change clinical practice. Before I talk, just my disclosures. I don't have any financial conflicts of interest to declare. And also I need to tell you that today I'm addressing you as a private citizen, not necessarily as a representative of the federal government. So don't bind me, my boss, or the president to anything that I may say today. All personal opinions. So it is Grand Rounds. Just wanted to review with you the educational objectives for today. I'm going to talk a bit about how treatment delays worsen outcomes in serious mental illness and why early intervention is a preferred approach for improving symptoms, functioning, and quality of life among young people who are experiencing a first episode of psychosis. I'm going to talk about a particular approach to evidence-based care for first episode psychosis, coordinated specialty care, and describe to you what the components of that treatment are. And then the main thrust of this talk is to describe a deployment-focused intervention strategy that was applied to try to engineer the broad adoption of an evidence-based approach after a scientific study was concluded. And that science has had a rapid and profound impact on the way that we treat first episode psychosis in the U.S. So I'm talking about first episode psychosis, but to put that in context, the reason we're so interested in first episode psychosis is very often a first episode of psychosis leads a chronic mental illness, schizophrenia very, very frequently. So if we think about, at NIMH, we're always thinking about public health impact, and the traditional ways that we think about whether a problem is of public health significance is based on its prevalence, its severity, the mortality associated with the disorder, and cost. And along each of those dimensions, schizophrenia clearly is a problem of public health significance. There are several million individuals in the United States in any given year who suffer from schizophrenia. They develop the illness either in late adolescence or early adulthood. Just at the time when they were beginning to make the transition into independent adult roles and functioning, the illness derails that and interrupts a lot of the contributions and the enjoyment that people can have in their lives. The treatment is often delayed in the U.S. It's very common for people to wait between 1 and 3 years before they're exposed to an adequate course of treatment. And during that period of time, unfortunately, a lot of disability accrues. For people with established schizophrenia, unemployment is very common. Between 80 and 90% of individuals with schizophrenia are unable to work competitively. Very high numbers of people, roughly 20% in any given year, are homeless. And among the individuals in U.S. jails and prisons, about 20% of them are people who are there and also have a diagnosis of schizophrenia. Recent research has told us that there's high mortality associated with schizophrenia, not only an elevated lifetime suicide rate of about 5%, but sadly, people with this disorder tend to die anywhere from 10 to 20 years earlier than other individuals in the population, usually from medical comorbidities that are highly treatable but are undiagnosed and are not treated. And then finally, it's very costly disorder, not only to individuals personally and their family members, but to society more broadly. In 2002, the total cost of schizophrenia was estimated to be $63 billion. Interestingly, only a third of that amount was related to direct care. The other 2/3 were related to the downstream impact of schizophrenia on family members, on their ability to work, on their medical problems, on society in terms of homelessness, incarceration, and so forth. So it's a problem. And in the U.S., unfortunately, until about the last 10 years, these kinds of outcomes were very common for people with schizophrenia. We initiated treatment late. We didn't give complete treatment, and these were the kind of outcomes that were common. And that was particularly disturbing to us at NIMH because around the early 2000s, certainly by 2005, it was very, very clear from research conducted worldwide that was not necessarily the course of schizophrenia, that if you intervened early and in a coordinated way, you really could improve outcomes for people with first episode psychosis. So research conducted in Australia, in Canada, the United Kingdom, in Europe, really built up a body of evidence that said we had approaches that included pharmacotherapy, psychological treatments, family support, and family psychoeducation and support, rehabilitative interventions, if put together in a package, really could influence the near-term outcomes or trajectory of the illness, so that it was possible for people to experience rapid relief from their psychotic symptoms. It was possible for them to stay out of the crisis and crisis intervention mode that's so common in early illness. We could decrease a variety of comorbidities, both substance abuse and medical, and overall improve functioning and restore people on a more normal trajectory of life. So if we knew all of that, why didn't that become the standard of care? Well, here's the main thrust of my talk. It takes a long time under usual circumstances to translate research findings into practice. The process or the hurdles that impede the translation or the transmission of knowledge into practice have been described by a number of authors. And you can see here there's a funneling process that goes on from the time that scientists generate their ideas to the time that they submit grants. The grants are reviewed. They complete the studies. They publish findings. The findings go through the normal process of peer review, synthesis, and then finally implementation into services. By the time we get to implementation, there's a whole different set of actors that get involved. These are the administrators who now need to figure out ways how to finance and support these programs. So it's been estimated that this very long and arduous process, it takes a long time, and very little of the research that's started actually makes its way into into the practice setting. So as we looked at this and we looked at these analyses, we tried to look for, was there any way that we could do business differently? And we were particularly interested in first episode psychosis as a clinical problem because we knew that there was evidence from other countries that we could do things better there. And we were wondering whether a new strategy for research could actually shorten this time frame that it would take to conduct a study and get it to get those results into the practice domain. So we put a challenge out to the field in 2008. We asked them to conduct research in first episode psychosis and to conduct this research with the end game in mind, that we wanted research that was actually going to implement, that was going to change clinical practice broadly. So we asked them to think about a trial that would incorporate all we knew at that point, features that are associated with rapid dissemination, adoption, and broad implementation of work so that it would benefit communities. And that came together. We drew heavily on an approach that was termed deployment-focused intervention development. John Weiss, Kimberly Hoagwood, these are people who are thought leaders in this area. And it's a simple concept. It's not easily applied, but the concept is take a very careful look at the end users of your intervention. Who are the people who are going to receive the treatment? Who are the people who are going to deliver the treatment? What's the situation where the care will be delivered? All of those factors need to be taken into account as you're developing your intervention. So it needs to be something that is applicable to a heterogeneous group of patients, not ones that are very specially selected for a clinical trial, but a population that reflects the characteristics of the broad population you're interested in helping. You need to look at the skills and the liabilities of clinicians that work in community health settings and come up with ways of training them and supporting their fidelity to evidence-based methods. And finally, you need to work with administrators so that they can find out ways that they can support this care over the long term. Can you make a business case for better care? So we took this into account, and we asked in this research project that you needed to conduct the research in real-world clinical settings with real-world patients. You needed to come up with practical strategies for training clinicians and administrative tools for operating these programs. And you had to demonstrate that you had partnerships with key stakeholders, with the people receiving care, the people delivering care, and the people who administer the care, so that we knew that we had buy-in from those communities, that they essentially would say, this research is valid, and we would pay attention to the results. So all of that came together in the NIMH project Recovery After an Initial Schizophrenia Episode, the RAISE project. It was announced in 2008. So today I'm going to tell you a bit about the last 10 years and where we are after 10 years of research, and give you a little bit of a peek into the future. So it's going to be a little bit of the science, a little bit of the backstory, and a little bit of what the future might look like. So I mentioned the importance of partners. As we were vetting the idea about doing research in first episode psychosis, intervention research, we went to the partners that we knew would be important for eventually supporting this care in the long term. So we got buy-in throughout the Department of Health and Human Services, from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration, from the Social Security Administration, for the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, the largest finance agency for healthcare in the United States, as well as other NIH institutes, and importantly, advocacy groups who were looking for better strategies for caring for people with serious mental illness. So we had them on board, and we focused our approach on a challenge to the field that would come up with research that would address these three questions. Is early intervention for first episode psychosis feasible within the United States? And what did it mean, feasible? It meant, can we introduce evidence-based care in community treatment settings that are not affiliated with academic research centers? We wanted to know if this could work in real-world settings with real-world clinicians. We also wanted to know whether you could use available funding mechanisms in 2008 to support this care. So it was a very, very practical emphasis. Then if it was feasible to do, we wanted to know if it would be effective. Would we get the same results that they had found in other countries? And then finally, we asked them to build this so that if the answer to the first two questions was yes, they had developed strategies and tools that would make it possible for bringing the approach to scale. So we asked the investigators to look at the available literature and to come up with a program that would be based on evidence-based care. So these were interventions that were well tested as of 2008, and to put them together so that a package of care would address the multiple needs of people with psychotic disorders. So eventually, over time, we came to call this approach, which is a multi-element, team-based approach, we came to call it coordinated specialty care. So there are 6 components to this. Just to briefly describe them. So we know young people with psychotic disorders respond to medications differently than older people who have been ill for years. You generally can get away with far less in terms of dosing, and you do that because these people are far more susceptible to side effects. So a low and slow approach is important, and it's the field has identified a number of strategies for first-line and second-line interventions that give us a way of thinking about pharmacotherapy for this particular group of young people who respond pretty well to available agents. But pharmacotherapy is just the start. It's not the only piece of this intervention. Equally important are psychological therapies that address the distress and the disruption that young people feel who have experienced a psychotic episode. For these people, their world has been turned upside down. The hopes that they had, the ideas about the future usually are just torn asunder. And the psychological treatment is really there to help them rethink or recapture the vision that they had for what their life would be like, the goals that they had, and then begin to give them practical strategies using problem solving, using cognitive reframing, using skills-based approaches to help them reestablish a pathway that they would be able to achieve those goals. It's important to include family psychoeducation and support. Family members, the illness of their relative is a crisis for the entire family. Very often family members don't know what is happening and they don't know how to help. So offering them education about the nature of the illness, the treatment options, the likelihood for recovery, some of the ups and downs that may be encountered, and then giving them practical support as they try to help their ill family member is really a very critical element for keeping the person moving forward. Case management services are often necessary, social services, and having a case manager that can help a family that's new to the system navigate all of these various agencies is an important part of care. And then finally, supported education and support. In 2008, we didn't know that much about the value of this intervention for people with first episode psychosis, but there was enough of an inclination that it was important that we allowed it to be included in the package. Turned out that was a really, really smart move. Because young people with psychosis, very rarely will they say to you, oh yes, I have a psychosis. Even less frequently will they say, oh yes, I will take the medication that you're recommending for me willingly and over a long period of time. But what they will say is, oh, you can help me get back to school? You can help me feel comfortable again with my friends? You can help me get a job? All right, I'll tolerate the rest of that crap if I can get that. And it becomes a magnet. It pulls them in and gives them some hope and gives them a reason to participate in the rest of the program. So here there are 5 elements. In the educational objectives, it said you will be able to describe the 6 elements of coordinated specialty care. The 6th one is the secret sauce of this. It's a team-based approach. So you need a team leader who actually is coordinating all of these elements so that they're not just a haphazard menu of activities that are offered, but actually they're all coordinated in a coherent way around a set of individualized goals, and that the treatment is tailored over time so that certain elements are accentuated, others are de-emphasized as the person moves forward in treatment. So coordinated specialty care, that was the thing that we wanted to see if that would be better than typical care in our RAISE research project. So there were 2 studies. The RAISE early treatment program was a randomized controlled trial. The RAISE connection program was an implementation and evaluation study. And I'll tell you a little bit more about those 2 programs in a second. Together, it was a pretty ambitious endeavor. 2 studies, with clinics spread across 22 states, 36 community clinics that were not affiliated with academic research centers were involved, over 130 providers who were employed in those settings were trained in special procedures that reflect coordinated specialty care. And across the 2 projects, there were 469 participants who met criteria for first episode psychosis and were broadly representative of that population. So that was the overall project. Now this is a part where I'm going to take you behind the scenes a little bit. So I talked about it's important to have stakeholders involved. And, this project was envisioned as a 5 to 7 year initiative with a randomized controlled trial. And any of you who have done RCTs, you know that the excitement is at the beginning and at the end. And in between, it's like watching paint dry. It's lots of things have to happen, but it's not that exciting. So we felt that as we analyzed what would be reasons why people would lose interest and would be less likely to implement over time, we needed to keep them engaged. So in the beginning, I already described this to you in the announcement and in the first year of the study, we reached out to Social Security Administration, SAMHSA, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, NIDA, the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation. All of them were on board, supportive of this project, and they were very interested in what would happen. As we moved from the pilot phase into the actual trial, you could see, if you notice this, that's a concrete expression of loss of interest. So Social Security Administration said, talk to us in 5 years. NIDA, once they got their measures in there, they, again, interested in what would happen. SAMHSA stayed a little bit connected, but you will notice there was a new partner there. So CMS turned into CMMI. CMMI was the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation. It actually was a new entity that was created in 2011 as part of the Affordable Care Act. And that group was particularly interested in strategies that would improve the quality of care, that would improve outcomes associated with care, and would drive down the cost of care. They were very, very interested in whether this approach, the first episode, Psychosis, would achieve those ends. They reached out to us, and we engaged in a very, very vigorous dialogue with them about how what the evidence was that led us to raise what we hope to accomplish. It turned out that dialogue, that conversation, that relationship proved to be very, very important a few years later. So we lost some partners, we gained a partner, and things were kind of going along like that until December of 2012. I don't know any historians here, if anybody remembers, but what happened in December 2012, sadly, was the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting. I felt very sad today when I looked at this slide again, and I thought to myself, you know, when I first put this slide together, Sandy Hook was like it seemed like it was a seminal event. Things would be different. It was just very sad today to think that there's been a half a dozen of these that have happened since Sandy Hook. But what happened after Sandy Hook was the executive branch of the federal government said, we need new approaches to this problem of gun-related violence, and we want to know what each agency has to offer. So the Department of Health and Human Services had a variety of approaches, but people began to focus in on this idea that, you know, we have now a history of young people with untreated mental illness being involved in these activities. Maybe there's something about early identification, early intervention that could be relevant. And suddenly there was a real return of interest in RAISE. So all of our federal partners became very, very engaged again in this. And in addition to those individuals, the U.S. Congress became very engaged. So Congress was looking for solutions as well. We had kept Congress involved or informed about the conduct of this study over time through annual reports. But after Sandy Hook, you can see the frequency of those interactions really increased. NIMH Director Tom Insel, at the time he was the director, he was briefing Congress sometimes 2 or 3 times a week on what we could do. And Congress kind of organized around this idea that maybe there's something in this mental health space that we could do. Now, I was really gratified that the congressional committees, the Appropriations Committee was so engaged. At the time, I was not aware that was partly a consequence of heavy advocacy from mental health groups like NAMI, Mental Health America, National Council of Behavioral Health Providers, who really were pushing Congress to invest in mental health and early intervention in particular. So in by the end of 2013, Congress was very interested in what was going on. The study had not yet been concluded, but along the lines, we had really tried to instill a sense of productive urgency in our researchers. And typically in a clinical trial, the trial is over, then the first paper that comes out is baseline characteristics, then the outcome paper, and then, maybe moderators of the effect. We knew in the beginning, because, we wanted to build this momentum for implementation, that we needed to do a faster job of that. So even before Sandy Hook, we were pushing the RCT investigators, John Kane and company, let's take a look at that baseline data, because it's going to tell us something about what typical care is like before we did this initiative. And it turned out it was a very sobering picture. We found out that the median duration of untreated psychosis was 74 weeks in these community clinics. That's almost 18 months of people being ill with the first episode of psychosis. This had not changed much in 20 years. The research that had been done previously in the U.S., the span was 1 to 3 years, so not much had changed there. As we looked at the kind of medication regimens that people were coming in with, 40% of them had medication regimens that didn't comport with treatment guidelines for first episode psychosis. These are widely available, widely publicized guidelines. They've been around for a long, long time. So clearly the typical route of dissemination of information was lacking in some regard. And then finally, maybe the most chilling of the findings was as we looked at cardiometabolic risk factors, we found that they were very common in this group of young individuals, mean age of 23. On some metabolic profiles, they actually had results that look more like people 20 years older than they were. For the most part, these were undiagnosed, unreferred, and untreated. Less than 5% of this group that had identifiable cardiometabolic risk factors at baseline were receiving care. We think this may be a foreshadowing of that 10 to 20 year difference in life expectancy that you see in established schizophrenia. So all of this was enough to say to all of the administrators in the department and in Congress, you know, we knew the things weren't great, but things actually are worse than we thought they were. We really need to, to move forward with this. The other program, the implementation study, at the same time was working very carefully in 2 states where the commissioners of mental health were co-investigators on the research project. They were analyzing what were the obstacles to be able to implement coordinated specialty care and working on tools that would be able to surmount those difficulties. And they came up with a number of papers that were very practical about how you would go about implementing these programs, how you would train people, how you would assess the fidelity of these programs, and then later how you would cost them out to be able to figure out how you would be able to afford them over time. Probably most importantly, though, was the fact that in 2013, the 2 states that were involved in the implementation study decided to move forward in expanding these programs within their state based on the preliminary results from the RAISE project. So New York State announced a new program called On Track New York. They went from 1 pilot program to 4. Today, that program is over 25 clinics in New York State. Maryland, later in that year, announced they were going to go from 1 clinic to 4. Maryland now has, I think, a total of 5 clinics. But the important thing here was, in both cases, the clinical administrators made decisions about implementation even before the papers were published. They were familiar with the data. They were familiar with the process. They found it actionable faster than the publication cycle. So they moved forward. Why was that important? Why was that important? It was important because, at that point, Congress was asking about, so we didn't have the results yet from the randomized controlled trial. And they were saying, well, should we invest in this? On what basis would we do it? And we were very honest in saying, look, what we can tell you today is we can only project from results from other countries. And we think that this is going to be a winner, but we don't have the data yet. But we were able to say, but 2 state governments decided that this evidence is good enough that they're investing their own dollars. And people tend to vote with their feet. They voted, and that actually was compelling to the appropriations committees to say, well, if 2 states are going forward on top of 2 states that were already doing it, we would feel comfortable in going forward. So as all of that was happening, the clinical trial was ending up. And not surprisingly, but happily for all involved, it turned out that coordinated specialty care which was offered over a 2-year period, was superior to typical care on a number of key dimensions. First of all, it was much more engaging. Patients in coordinated specialty care stayed in treatment much longer than people in community care. They achieved a significantly greater rate of recovery in terms of quality of life, in terms of symptom improvement, both overall symptoms and depression. They returned to school and work at a higher rate than people in community care. And importantly, a cost-effectiveness analysis indicated that coordinated specialty care was more cost-effective, was a better value than typical care. An important finding of this, those were the overall effects. And to be honest, when you look at just Navigate versus community care, the effects were modest. The effect size was only about 0.34 difference in effect size on overall improvement quality of life. But interestingly, when the investigators looked at whether duration of untreated psychosis moderated that effect, a very important finding jumped out. Turned out that duration of untreated psychosis is a very critical variable. The timing of the treatment is as important as the treatment that is offered. So people who were ill for less than 74 weeks improved at a much greater rate. So the effect size there is 0.54, which, 0.3 is a difference that a researcher would notice and maybe a doctor would notice. They would say, yeah, the person's a little bit better. But 0.54 is something that the person themselves would notice, their family member would notice, their teacher would notice. That's a meaningful effect. So our take home from this was it's not just enough to do the right thing, but you need to do the right thing at the right time. And that spun off a whole series of research initiatives on applied research to reduce duration of untreated psychosis in the U.S. Wanted to unpack that duration of untreated psychosis finding in terms of cost effectiveness just for a second. I'm not a health economist, and quite frankly, every time I read that paper, it's like I'm reading it the first time. It's very well done, but it's over my head. But this is the takeaway of the finding. For the Navigate patients with lower DUP, the cost of their care is actually lower than the cost of usual care. So in that quadrant, you're getting a much better outcome for lower cost. So it gives us an idea to say that for going forward, we are on the right direction. If we pursue simultaneously reducing DUP and introducing the right kind of care, we're on a pathway where we actually will not only get higher value, but we'll do it in a cost-effective manner. So by 2015, we had answers to 2 of our 3 questions. It did appear to be feasible to introduce these programs. Pardon me just for a second. So I always get choked up at this point. So in all, between the 2 programs, there were 19 of these new programs that were established in the U.S. They operated from 2 to 4 years. They were able to enroll patients. The patients stayed in the care. They found it meaningful, and we were able to train the providers and so forth. So it appeared to be feasible. The results of the outcome study, the clinical trial, told us that that early intervention is more effective than usual care. So the question was, could the research-based services be brought to scale? And here's where the Congressional Investment really played a role. So in the beginning of 2014, Congress, based on the research that was available at that point, increased funds that were available for early intervention to the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration by $25 million. This was the 5% set aside to the mental health block grant. It was allocated specifically for first episode psychosis, and importantly, the Congress said that NIMH and SAMHSA needed to work together to develop guidance for states. So we did this. On the NIMH side, and again, we had our investigators on a very rapid cycle of producing materials related to the eventual dissemination. Turned out that we disseminated these things about 2 years before we anticipated, but the investigators were ready. We were able to pull all of that together, and on our website, in addition to materials, which I'll show you in a second, we were able to summarize everything we knew up until that point into a guidance document for state administrators. Well, you'll see it there, state health administrators and clinics, that would tell them in a how-to way how you could go about building these programs yourself. In addition to the guidance, we had practical tools. We had manuals, we had recovery videos, we had tools for program administration, and so forth. And importantly, we had a cadre of experts who are now prepared to offer training nationwide. And that was the next thing that SAMHSA and NIMH did together. Between 2014 and 2015, we were doing about 3 activities a month: webinars, staff training events, presentations to national organizations. Dr. Piper Meyer-Kalos in the audience is one of the national trainers for the Navigate program, was involved in these efforts, and she stays involved. So we were getting the information out, and importantly, that cost-effectiveness study convinced the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services to recognize Navigate as an evidence-based treatment that they would reimburse for via the Medicaid program. This was a really big win for us, to have a payer say that not only is it evidence-based, but we will give you a mechanism for getting paid to implement it. So all of this was coming together. The Congress continued their funding, 2014. They continued it in 2015, which said to the states, this may actually be more than just a one-off. Maybe it's going to continue. So we began to see some investment in these programs. The Congress then doubled the amount of the set-aside in 2016 to $50 million. And then in December 2016, the 21st Century Cures Act took that 10% set-aside for first episode psychosis out of the appropriations process and made it the law of the land. 10% of the state mental health block grant funds are to be allocated for the purpose of early serious mental illness, including first episode psychosis, and that law is in effect for 10 years. So for 2016 to 2026, we now have a law that says this is the new standard of care, and states need to follow it. So this is how this played out over time. In 2008, so we could look at the SAMHSA block grant program requires states to submit a plan that says how they're going to use the money, and then they report every 2 years on how they use the money. So we were able to use those plans to estimate how many states had a commitment to early intervention and psychosis before RAISE, and how their practices changed over time after RAISE. So in 2008, there were 2 states that were early adopters in this regard. Oregon and California, as states, had come up with a commitment to this approach, and it really stayed pretty static. Other states didn't jump on board until the RAISE project was underway. New York and Maryland jumped on. So by the end of 2014, we had gone from 2 states to 4. But you can see it was the introduction of the mental health block grant dollars that really was the tipping point. So from 2015 on, we went from 4 states to today. Today, actually, the number is 49. There are 49 states that have plans in the mental health block grant that specify how they're developing and implementing these programs. And that happened not by chance, but by a specific process of moving the science forward in collaboration with our colleagues at SAMHSA. So in terms of the number of states with coordinated specialty care programs, I need to update this map. I know from SAMHSA that there are 49 states now. I did make sure that I had the right information for Minnesota. So I know you guys are there. Thank you for that. But today there are 49 states. Interesting to look at the number of programs that actually operate. So in 2008, before RAISE, looking at the mental health block grant programs, we could only identify 12 programs that looked like coordinated specialty care. They were all clustered in Oregon, for the most part. Even California did not identify specific clinics, but Oregon did. So there were 12 12 of these programs in 2008. By 2016, so this is after RAISE and after 2 years of the mental health block grant, it had gone up to 114 programs nationwide. And then in 2016, based on the state's plans, we estimated by 2018 there would be 189 of these programs. The reality, the actual count today is 215. There are 215 of these programs across the United States. So that's a pretty rapid increase in the number of programs based on the research. So, related to the original research questions, it's feasible, it's more effective, and we are able to implement those things broadly. So how does this get, so what have we learned about translating research into practice? So we go back to the beginning of the talk. It takes a long time and very little of the research moves forward. That was our benchmark. That was the result to beat, 17 years and 14% of the research. And what we found with RAISE is we think that we have evidence that we were able to shave a decade off that estimated 17 years using this deployment-focused intervention development process as kind of a framework at the beginning, and then just working that problem over time. I mean, clearly there were a lot of things that we couldn't anticipate. I mean, we didn't know about Sandy Hook. We didn't know that the Congress would get so enthusiastic. We didn't know that things would change with the Affordable Care Act. We didn't know any of that in 2008. But we knew enough to know that if we didn't push those things forward, nothing was going to happen. So we did something that we thought might be good, because if we didn't do that, we knew nothing would much change. So the study launched in 2009. Our first win was in 2010. One of the pilot sites for the RAISE Navigate program, they finished their year as a pilot site, and they just decided they were going to continue doing this. They were going to run this outside of the research context. That actually was the first clinic that was established as a function of the research. That program went on over time. There's now close to 20 coordinated specialty care programs in Ohio that were based on that original RAISE program. 2013, I described to you what we saw as the landscape of typical care and what kind of outcomes that had, and that was important to galvanize the interest of our partners in the Congress. 2013, the state partners in the RAISE implementation study decided to go forward and fund using state funds to move those programs forward. That turned out to be a critical determinant in the Congress's interest in putting money to the nation broadly. So in 2014, we had the first infusion of mental health block grant findings. When the results of the trial came out in 2015, particularly the cost-effectiveness finding, was very influential to CMS to say we in fact have an intervention that meets the criteria of high quality, desired outcome, and cost effectiveness. We're going to go forward with that. And in 2016, I think we reached a tipping point. We went almost 3/4 of the states by 2016 had signed on to this, and we had crossed the threshold of 100 programs. So there's more to do, but we accomplished quite a bit in a relatively short period of time. So, to summarize, I've described to you how treatment delay is associated with worse outcomes in serious mental illness. I think I've demonstrated that early intervention can improve symptoms, community functioning, and quality of life among people with first episode psychosis. Coordinated specialty care is a multi-element, team-based, empirically supported approach to early intervention. It was tested in the RAISE project. It was replicated in an independent study from Yale, the specialized treatment in early psychosis trial that appeared within several months of the RAISE outcome study. So we now have 2 well-conducted randomized controlled trials in the United States that indicate that this is a preferred approach. Deployment-focused implementation research method clearly hastened the uptake of specialty care in the U.S., and now we have SAMHSA and CMS recognizing coordinated specialty care as an evidence-based treatment for FEP. So, Sophia, how am I doing for time? Okay, so I have like maybe 5 minutes more. This was my absolute, like if I had no time, I could stop here and say that I gave you everything that I have. But now, let me tell you a little bit about the future. So we've been thinking about, I can't retire for a few years, so I need something else to do. So what do you do after Raise? Well, you look beyond Raise and you say, or you ask, if we have 200 evidence-based clinics in the United States, if they're offering evidence-based high-quality care, that's a great thing. But imagine what might be possible if we were able to coordinate the efforts across those 200 clinics and create a learning healthcare system among them that really became an engine for further quality improvement, health services research, and eventually as a platform for launching translational science. So we've come up with a concept called the Early Psychosis Intervention Network, EpiNet, that is based on the framework of a learning healthcare system that was described a number of years ago by the Institute of Medicine. It's built on the idea that if you have standardized measures that can capture key aspects of clinical care and an informatics approach that allows you to aggregate data so that you can study things like variation in treatment outcome, in quality, value, so forth, that you could, every clinical encounter could become an opportunity to learn something both about the process of care and also about the disorder under question. So our goal is to implement this broadly and to do it in a way that creates a culture shift in these early psychosis programs, so it's seen as a collaborative enterprise between people receiving care, people delivering care, and scientists who are studying the care and trying to improve its impact. So we've laid out a multi-year process for this that would allow us to accomplish the pieces of learning healthcare in a modular kind of way. So in 2015 and 2016, we launched an effort to identify a set of standard measures for first episode psychosis clinical care and translational science. We did this through the Phoenix Toolkit. Phoenix was a process that was developed by the Genome Institute to find standard measures of phenotypes and exposures, that's where Phoenix comes from, that could be used in large-scale genomics research. It's now an approach that's been adopted very broadly by NIH institutes to come up with a way of finding practical, low-burden, common data elements that could be used to accelerate research. So we were able to use that process to create toolkits, both of clinical service measures and translational research measures that are now available for wide use. Having the standardized measures is one thing. Knowing that it would be possible to collect those measures in these kinds of community programs that I described to you previously is another question. So we partnered with SAMHSA and with the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation to fund a study that's looking at the fidelity to evidence-based care in a number of the first episode psychosis treatment programs that were established under the Mental Health Block Grant. So that fidelity evaluation of the 10% set aside is looking at about 40 programs distributed through the United States. We're learning a lot about how we can implement standardized care into routine workflows in these programs. And while we're doing that, we're working on developing the healthcare informatics that would support an enterprise like EpiNet that captures data on clinical encounters and can turn it over for several different purposes. So we have a Gantt chart, we have a timeline, and we have some accomplishments. So the Phoenix Early Psychosis Common Data Elements are available to the community. The evaluation, fidelity and evaluation study was launched in late 2016. It's well underway. We've learned a lot from it already, and in about a year, we'll have the final findings. At NIMH, we've had a series of workshops that have engaged different stakeholders in what would be informatics platforms that would be able to support learning healthcare in these programs. And we're imagining that later this year, there'll be an announcement that will take those ideas and communicate them to the community, looking for ideas about how we can move from a concept into actual operations. And we imagine that by the first quarter of 2019, we'll actually have an alpha version of a learning healthcare system that probably will involve somewhere in the range of 30 to 50 clinics in the country that are coordinated in this way, where we'll be gathering up data from several thousand first episode psychosis patients and being able to explore how we might use that for the purposes of quality improvement, program evaluation, health services research, create a platform that would allow discovery science to move forward. So, you don't do anything like this alone. Although I tell my wife all the time it's just me. But on my team, Susan Azrin, Lisa Culp, Amy Goldstein, Joanne Severe, Michaela Scanlon, all have been in this for the long haul, and each of them have made substantial critical contributions. And I also want to acknowledge my colleagues at the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration, who just have been terrific partners in moving this evidence-based knowledge into practice in a large number of settings in the U.S. So that's it. That's a thank you. I appreciate your attention.
I'm David Klein, and a practitioner out in the community, and I'm so glad to hear your presentation here. And I want to ask you, what are the critical, have you sense of what the critical elements in these programs that will make for success for a good outcome for these interventions? And I want to bring two cases to our attention. One appeared last Sunday in the front page of the New York Times, in a rather extensive discussion of a very gifted woman who became schizophrenic, although the diagnosis was never very clear because she never got to a psychiatrist, it seemed like, or to a mental health system. And she went on for about 20 or 30 years, finally died on the streets of New York, and never having really gotten connected with the system that could have made a difference for her. That's one case. The other one is a case that I'm taking care of in a residential treatment center, a 17-year-old boy who has schizophrenia and is no longer a first episode because he's had his first episode a couple of years ago. He gets treated, he gets better, he goes home, he says, I don't need the medicine, and he goes off and he gets sick again, and it's back and forth and back and forth. So finally, he's now in a closed residential treatment center, and he's not getting too much better. However, he is better than he was, in part because he was legally consigned to take injections of medicine on a regular basis, which he now agrees that he needs, and that he's willing to start to consider. However, I'm sure that if he walked out of our center now, he would do the same thing. So the point is, what have we got to do here to make a connection between these patients and a contract for long-term care that will hold them and have a good outcome?
So those are two excellent examples of some of the limitations of our current approach. I would say for the first case that you mentioned, one thing that again, from other countries, one thing that we know is that many young people who are already in contact with the mental health treatment system, their developing psychosis is not recognized in a timely way, and the transfer to specialty care doesn't occur naturally or smoothly. So I don't know this particular individual, but I can say one thing that we are emphasizing is there has to be, we have to emphasize both education and screening with among people, youth that are currently receiving services, to see whether there are people who are both at risk for and in the very early stages of psychosis. So before the symptoms become grip them and really interfere with their ability to make judgments, about their care, that we can offer them something so that we can approach this in a collaborative manner. So this is related to that duration of untreated psychosis and trying to get access early and in and to the appropriate care. So that's one thing that we're working on. For the second case, I think this is a real, boy, you're putting your finger on a real conundrum, and this is common. In many programs, the emphasis on shared decision-making has been a vehicle by which there can be more conversations about, for example, medication and its value in relation to other goals that the person has. It's not foolproof, but there have been a lot of reports that this kind of approach makes it more likely for the person to accept medication within an experimental framework, meaning that, I'll agree to take this, and here are some outcomes that together we will look at, and you'll agree that my input about side effects and benefit will be taken into account for adjusting the medicine. That seems to have been, in the New York experience, they're finding this to be a very useful way of increasing adherence to medication over the long term. So you put your finger on two very real problems that aren't completely solved, but those are two partial answers about where the research is leading us.
Thank you for the presentation. So would the Navigate or the program that you're talking about for first episode, they would have a finite time, right, in which they are, the patient is enrolled in. And so I'm wondering if you already have data from at least the earlier studies that started in 2009 about a continuity of care of some of these patients once they have completed, and whether or not there are continued successes because there was that little bit of advantage that was taken through the trial itself.
This is a very astute crowd, putting your fingers on all the soft points. In fact, there is research that so most of these programs have offered care for about 2 years. And the strategy in the prior studies has been, okay, so after 2 years, if the person needs additional care, they just get transitioned into the usual care system. We now know that if you follow those people for another 5 years, after about 5 years, their outcomes are not that much different than people who never got into the early treatment program. So there is a decline that happens over time. And so people have it's an empirical question about how long the treatment ought to be, how you move from kind of an active acute care phase into a continuation phase, and what are the supports that could continue to bolster recovery. So there are clinical trials that are looking at the duration of the treatment and seeing whether there's an optimal dose that would sustain things over time. There are some trials that are looking at establishing virtual support networks using social communication platforms that would give people a community, a recovery community to plug into, that would be able to be a resource to them as they're encountering new problems, as in school or work or with perturbations and symptoms and things like that. So Those studies are ongoing, and we have been encouraging in the U.S. people taking this on as a research question that needs more work. And hopefully EpiNet will actually be able to be a platform by which we'll be able to conduct some of those studies in a cost-effective way with large samples. But you put your finger on a really key issue for future research.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that talk. This is a kind of positive story we don't get to hear too often, so it's really, really wonderful. So many things to comment on, but I was very struck with one thing, particularly the funnel at the beginning, the 17-14, 17 years, 14%. It struck me as, I don't know the data, but it struck me pretty accurately. And you've overcome that by a decade. So that was on the 17-year part you overcame. On the 14% part is also still tough. You know, not all research, the most of it probably isn't going to ever merit a change of the scope or even anything close to it. So you had a leg up, you know, and I'm glad you did from overseas research. It sounds like you were able to tell people, look, you know, we've just got to dot some I's here, make sure it works here, it works elsewhere. I just wonder if you could comment on that 14% part. How do we know what to invest this kind of resources in?
Now, I promised that I did not plant this man in the audience, but if I had additional time, I would have told you about the Division of Service and Intervention Research at NIMH, and our mission is to try to find, acknowledging exactly what you're saying, not all science is ripe for immediate translation into practice. So what we learned with the first episode experience is you need to hunt out the opportunities. So where are the places where there's enough knowledge that you could say this is actionable for pushing forward? And the experience with RAISE has really informed our approach to practice-oriented translational research. So look for clinical problems and treatment delivery systems where near-term traction is possible, meaning that there's enough information that tells you with another push you can go forward. You know, we feel very strongly that this focus on end-user deployment issues was critical for RAISE, and we have seen it in several other examples of research that we've done subsequently. These strategic and operational partnerships, and then harmonizing assessment methods and data sharing to move the ball forward. This is our approach, and our near-term scientific agenda has really made some progress in areas like suicide prevention research, autism spectrum disorder services research across the lifespan, and in general research to move forward evidence-based or measurement-based care. So within suicide area, we funded a very large study of universal screening and suicide prevention interventions in emergency departments, the EdSafe study. And these results indicated that universal screening in emergency department settings doubles the rate of suicide risk detection. So we pick up far more people who are at risk for suicide. And the next study from that particular project illustrated how if you combine universal screening with safety planning and post-discharge phone check-ins, suicide attempts decreased by 30% over 12 months. So again, this was deployment focused in that real-world EDs, and each of these things, the screening, the safety planning, and the telephone check-ins, there was an empirical literature supporting each of these of having some degree of impact. So we put those together. Well, we funded a study that put them together. I already told you about RAISE. I won't get into this. And this is just, we've had like 15 funding announcements over the last 5 years that have focused on this area to say, tell us what the areas of opportunity are. Make the case for how deployment-focused intervention methods would work within this area, and we will support it. Thank you for that opportunity. Gave me.
Hello, thank you for a very nice presentation. I'm a child psychiatrist. My name is Afshan Anjum. I'm interested in your opinion on ideas about how to approach our prodrome and high-risk populations in terms of improving the DUP and the outcomes. If there are any initiatives or funded projects that you could educate us about today.
With the difference between, or one difference between the clinical high-risk research and the first episode psychosis research is it's a little bit easier in the community to make a determination about first episode psychosis. It still requires a high level of training to be able to make a determination about a clinical high-risk state for psychosis. And that's been a bit of, well, not a bit, that's been a limitation for being able to move that research out of highly specialized research centers and broadly embrace the community. We have not been able to figure out a way that we can do those diagnoses reliably over a large number of programs. And that presents some limitations because we get very, very high quality research that comes out of the academic research centers that specialize in this, but there may be some filtering of the patients who come to those programs, and they may not be representative of the larger population of people that are experiencing the development of psychosis in community settings. I can tell you that the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration is very, very interested in looking at how we could push the envelope on identification and evidence-based treatment for clinical high risk. In the 21st Century Cures Act, they actually were given permission to move in that direction. When a fiscal year 18 funding bill is signed, there is money in their budget that would allow them to move in that direction. And they've asked NIMH to partner with them to find ways that we would be able to translate some research-based practices into those community clinics so that we would be able to study a broader population. I think it's going to be, when we do that, we'll be in a place to address the question that you addressed about duration of untreated illness in people with prodrome. It's a critical area. I mean, if we can identify there and intervene there, the chances of altering the trajectory are very, very high.
So now that these programs are available in 49 states, how do you maintain enough fidelity to the original model that programs don't become diluted and spread to a greater population than the RAISE concept would, the data would indicate where you can really make a difference? Your data already shows that some of the population served probably isn't benefiting because they have too long a DUP by the time they come to treatment. We already know clinically that there's another group at the other end of the spectrum that probably does well no matter what we do and did well 20 years ago with available treatments. So really RAISE benefits should be focused on the group in the middle where we can make a difference. But if you spread something out, make it universal, administrators are always wanting to spread out more, serve more people, more populations. How do you maintain that? There was a terrific presentation earlier today by Sophia's group where they were reanalyzing the RAISE data and showing and addressing just this issue that you had about trying to identify the people who benefit most from Navigate. And I don't know whether you were in the room, but actually the findings kind of, you could suppose that there are some people who
have a very, very good prognosis. They do very well. There are people who don't do well at all, and then there's that group in the middle that do pretty well, but you might imagine that would be a group that you would want to further refine this intervention so to get them from pretty well up into the upper group. So I just wanted to validate what you're saying is that they're looking at these data, and I think will maybe give us some additional avenues for thinking about how we can further improve this. The question about fidelity, I think that's a great one, and so one, we're going to have this first check on fidelity from the SAMHSA ASPE NIMH project about how well states have done in establishing clinics that adhere to the evidence-based principles using the block grant dollars. But my real hope is with EpiNet, we'll actually be able to not only monitor that, but we'll be able to give every program a report card that says, okay, on these dimensions, like engagement, retention, delivery of services, or so forth, this is how you do for your cohort. And we can look at that compared to the distribution of outcomes that you get in the rest of the network. So you might be able to see that on engagement, the rest of the network is, so there's a distribution that falls into low, medium, and high fidelity, and you can see where you are in relation to that distribution, and it becomes maybe a piece of information that allows those programs to target their efforts to improve fidelity. Someday that might be used as information that incentivizes high fidelity care in the sense that maybe programs that offer the highest fidelity actually get bonuses for what they do. And then you can imagine what the second stage of that is for people who don't meet fidelity. There may be some incentives to improve that could be added to that.
I have a question.
Oh, could I say one? But just to finish, to complete that thought, my belief is, or the recognition is that there's a big drop-off in effect size as you move from a randomized controlled trial to community care. That's true, but I don't believe it has to be that way. I think that these learning healthcare centers ought to look at the randomized controlled trial and just say, that's a result that we got under these conditions. We can beat that. And how can we beat it? We can beat it by having this measurement-based approach that has micro experiments that target areas for quality improvement and looks at the relationship of that quality improvement to these outcomes. I think that instead of getting this dilution of effect, we can create virtuous cycles that actually take the RCT result as the starting point and begin to beat that.
So I have a question which may be more of a, I don't know, it's a kind of larger systems philosophy question. I mean, coordinated specialty care is likely the care of choice for a number of serious psychiatric illnesses, not just early psychosis, early bipolar illness, early expression of, in fact, early and later expression, right, of these disorders, early expression of serious depression in adolescents, behavioral disruption in younger children. So I guess my questions are, number one, doing the research to prove that is long, costly, complex. Do you think there's enough accumulating evidence, say, from certain disorders, such as early psychosis, to suggest it should be aspects of it that could be used or brought to other illnesses should be kind of underway, maybe without the 7 years of research it would take to demonstrate effectiveness?
Yeah, I actually think there are two other areas where there's enough evidence that exists that suggests that we have some common principles. So you look at collaborative care for depression. It's team-based in the sense that you have a primary care physician, you have a depression care manager, you have a psychiatric consultant, and you have the patient receiving care. It's a measurement-based approach to care. So there's a very consistent measurement of symptoms and looking at the relationship of symptoms and adverse events or side effects in relation, and an empirical approach to improving the treatment until you get to the desired outcome. There's some similarities there to coordinated specialty care. ACT programs for serious mental illness, team-based, coordinated set of services to meet multiple needs of individuals, treatment plans that are organized around individual goals, a tailoring of the treatment plan over time. We know that for people who were previously characterized as treatment resistant and high utilizers with serious mental illness, ACT programs are very, very effective. So now we have a non-SMI affective disorder group, we have a SMI established illness group, and we have first episode psychosis. And we can say in each of these cases, we aspire to articulating treatment goals of critical interest to the individual, their care provider, ways of measuring progress towards achieving those goals, recognizing that these disorders are complex. It often involves a team approach, which requires a context for team conversations and decision making. I think that that you could put enough of that together and say that this ought to be the way that we ought to just do care.
Without having to go through several more steps.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
You have been disconnected from the meeting.